Okay, in today's lecture, we're going to be looking at Chapter 14 concerning prison life, the inmate's world, who are the people that are working in these facilities, and what the operations of those facilities look like. So, prisons, correctional facilities are places of peril. They're very dangerous places. There have been several major riots that have occurred throughout the history of the United States. In Atlanta, there was a famous riot that occurred at the Atlanta Federal Institution because there were a lot of Cuban national refugees that were housed there, and the those conditions mixed with the general conditions of the prison at the time created a situation where there was a riot. There's a lot of information you can check out about that. Several documentaries have been made as well, if you have interest in looking that up. Another famous riot that took place was the riot at Attica in New York, which resulted in the deaths of almost 40 people. Millions of dollars paid out to the families of inmates, the families of correctional officers, and again, it just highlighted the intense danger, inherent danger as well, that occurs in these correctional facilities. It also showed that you can't have a situation where the officers are just brutalizing the inmates. In any facility in the country, the inmates vastly outnumber the officers, so they have to be aware of that, and they have to work with the inmates instead of trying to just dehumanize them and brutalize them in these correctional environments. Some of the issues that come up during these riots, hostage situations, the situations with negotiating for the release of hostages. Typically, correctional officers sign in their contracts that they will not be used as hostages, so they are not allowed to negotiate like that. The demands that the inmates have are usually, most of them are fairly reasonable, having to do with conditions, health care, food, things like that. A common misrepresentation of correctional institutions, especially in movies and on TV, is how many guns are in there. You typically don't have very many firearms in a correctional institution, because if you do, then you have firearms inside of a correctional institution. And we go back to that illusion of control, that the inmates can basically take the institution anytime that they want. So you don't want to have a lot of guns inside these facilities because it's more likely that bad things are going to happen with the guns. Jail personnel, correctional personnel, really both are fairly undertrained in terms of necessities to perform the job. They are definitely underpaid. They have limited educational requirements for these positions because it's hard to get people to apply for them because of being underpaid. And they're run by various agencies. So at a jail, it might be a police department, it might be a sheriff's department, it might be its own Department of Corrections, just depending on how large the bureaucracy is for that area. There's a lot of things they have to worry about. They have to worry about liability for their treatment of inmates. If something goes wrong, if they don't know that someone has a medical condition and they act in an inappropriate manner, they have to worry about communicable diseases. It's a big issue right now in spring of 2020, the welfare and the transmission of a virus in these facilities. They've had to worry in the past about spread of AIDS and HIV, as well as other sexually transmitted diseases. That's been an issue in prison environments for as long as there have been prisons, because the inmates will typically find some way to engage in sexual activities. The issues of addiction, bringing of drugs and other contraband into facilities. The security in these facilities is very important. Again, it's an illusion of control, but they still have to do their job every day. There's also mental health issues from the inmates, and also the mental health strains of doing this job. It's very taxing on the officers and the inmates, both as part of this process. Correctional officers are sort of the frontline support of the correctional system, though oftentimes they sort of have to act as basically another gang in these facilities. They're vastly outnumbered. There is limited um, force that they can use in terms of not having firearms. So they have to operate in a manner of high intelligence if they want the facilities to be run smoothly, if they want them to be run safely. The main thing that they do is observe, try to see when things are going to happen, predict when things are going to happen, know when to issue a lockdown before something happens as opposed to afterwards. But there is still a vast amount of stress that goes along with being a correctional officer, which is again one of the reasons why it's hard to get people to perform this task. Oftentimes, there's not enough funding to have as much staff there as they would like. The officers are understaffed, they're overworked because they have to work multiple shifts. They have the constant threat of violence, also the constant threat of having cups of urine and feces, a handful of semen thrown on them. It's a tough job. So there is this constant struggle between the officers trying to maintain an orderly, safe environment, while at the same time not seeming to be, having some show of strength, because they can't seem to just be able to be walked over by the inmates. So it's a struggle to maintain a very tense homeostasis in terms of the social environment in a correctional facility. So following some of the major issues that took place with the riots in the 60s and the 70s, they've changed the selection process for correctional officers much the same way they have with police officers. Maintaining certain basic human conditions has been very important. Looking out for the interests of the inmates to some degree. Again, some inmates are gonna make up stories. They're gonna breed falsehoods about the facility, but sometimes they're not doing that. Sometimes things are actually bad that are happening. So it's important to be able to understand and listen to the inmates. They want to maintain security for everyone, for the inmates, for the officers. They understand that there's a cooperation that needs to take place between the officers and the inmates. You can't just have one side working against the other. Both these individuals are going to have to be there. The inmates have to be there because they're sentenced there. The officers have to be there because that's their job. So how can we have these two people coexist in the same area, as much as possible to make the process as safe as possible for everyone around? But these institutions are mirrors of the social environment. So if there are things that are happening in the environment that are that have a class struggle or a race struggle or just a power balance and power imbalance that people are worried about, that shows up in the prison relationship between the correctional officers and the inmates, because it's a very simple relationship, but there's a lot of things that are happening there. Some of the other things they've done to adjust the perception of the correctional setting, changing the names to correctional officers instead of guards, sort of reframing the task. They have increased the pay and the recognition of the risk in terms of insurance policies and things like that, changes in laws to protect the officers, and increased sanctions on the inmates for attacking them or violating them, but it's still relatively low. They've also tried to increase the knowledge that the officers have about the constitutional protections that they should be giving to the inmates. Also, being more respectful of individual culture and ethnic considerations that go on in a facility. Someone's choice of diet, someone's schedule of religious observations. Those things are very important for that cooperation to take place. If someone feels disrespected towards their culture, their ethnic heritage, or their religion, it's not going to be very likely that they're going to cooperate with the officers on really anything. They've also made sure the officers have increased physical fitness as well as increased communication skills. It's very important to have those things when you're operating in a correctional environment. Much like with policing, the duties of correctional officers are highly delegated throughout the facility. There are officers that maintain the cell blocks, the areas where the inmates sleep, where they spend a lot of their time when they're not outside. There are officers that review and supervise work detail when the officers go, the inmates go outside of the facility to do trash cleanup and things like that. There were actually a couple inmates on a work detail here in Georgia about a year and a half ago that rendered first aid and called paramedics when an officer had a heart attack during this process. You also have officers that monitor industrial shops, educational programs, officers that are on the ground in the outside yard areas, and also officers that are in the towers around the facilities. The tower officers typically are going to be armed either with rifles that have rubber bullets or real bullets. The thought is that they're up in those towers, they're kind of away from the other areas. And they also are the ones that have the views of the whole area, the whole prison, so they can stop someone that potentially is trying to escape. You also have officers that are assigned to administrative buildings, handling visitors coming in and out, handling shipments, deliveries. Like I said, there's a variety of tasks that officers are going to have, depending on what the bureaucratic, what the logistical needs of a facility are. The warden is basically the boss of the facility. They're the highest paid individual in the facility. They oversee all of the programs, tasks, and have the final say on most decisions that are made about the operation of an individual facility. The philosophy that a warden has, whether they're pushing incapacitation, rehabilitation, deterrence, retribution, whether they're very strict, whether they're relaxed in their implication of the rules, is going to have a very heavy impact on the operations of a facility. It's important, depending on what the security level of the facility is and how that lines up with what the goals that the warden has. So it's very important to note that when you're looking at how a facility is being run, what are the standards that the individuals are being held to. It's also the job of the warden to kind of be, like I said, sort of the top hall monitor, the principal of the facility. So they have to be the ones that are at the front lines of zeroing in on the issues, figuring them out, and handling them before they become major problems. So looking for things that just don't look right. Inmates hanging out together, talking together. Inmates from rival gangs or factions talking together. A lot of loud music or commotion meant to cover up other conversations that are taking place. Another common one that is monitored is high canteen spending. So are people spending a lot of extra money buying things like food and other goods that they would want to have in their cells, anticipating a long lockdown? The inmates are oftentimes more aware of when those things are going to happen than the correctional officers. At least they're gonna know first. The inmates are gonna know first. They have to sort of watch the cues that they're giving, social cues. An important aspect of maintaining prisons, operating prisons, is dealing with the complaints that come in, as we talked about before, and then during, even after the riots that had taken place. There were differences of opinion about how the prison should be run. There was a push to try to restrict or at least make the process more formal for making claims against a correctional facility. So again, as we've seen, we saw about a 300% increase in the prison population from 1980 to 2010. So seeing a jump of a little less than three times of the complaints during this time period isn't necessarily something that you wouldn't expect, but they did to avoid having to handle and review most of these claims, which turned out to be baseless. They instead made the process a little bit more difficult with the Prison Litigation Reform Act 1995, where the prisoners must try and address the issue within the facility, pay the court filing fees, and show physical harm before filing any grievance related to injury to try to reduce the frequency of those frivolous uh, complaints that were coming in. So in 1997, we see almost 63,000 complaints. By 2009, that's reduced to less than 11,000. So it's a much more manageable amount while not putting that many undue restrictions on legitimate claims. Another issue inside of a correctional facility is drugs. Drugs come in. Drugs come in because they're very expensive inside a correctional setting, often 10 times the street value. So a $100 gram of heroin on the outside might be worth almost $1,000 inside of a correctional facility. Um, the drugs come in through two ways. Either the correctional officers bring it in, which, you know, it's not that every correctional officer is doing this. They typically have a little bit higher corruption rates than police officers, but it's still not that high. But it doesn't take that many officers to bring in enough drugs to satisfy an entire facility. The other way that things are brought into prisons are in people's butts. So correctional officers bring it in, or it came in somebody's butt. And the reason that that happens is because there's a demand for the substances. There's also they've also tried to increase the punishments for drugs inside facilities for the officers, for the inmates. There have been varying degrees of success when this has happened. Um, so they've, again, in different areas, depending on what policies they've used, depending on the buy-in they've had from the correctional officers, from the inmates, it's varying degrees. In most facilities, though, there is still a way. There are still ways to get stuff in there. That's just the nature of human innovation. With respect to addiction, there are far more addicts in correctional facilities than there are bed spaces and rehabilitation programs, or even more addicts than these facilities have the ability to treat and to see. You've got about, if you over half of the individuals going into correctional facilities at the state level have a drug addiction issue, and only about 15% of those are going to get any kind of treatment for it. As far as the rates of women in correctional facilities, we see about 2.1 million arrests for female offenders each year. There are about 200,000 in jail or in prison, so it's less than 10% of the incarcerated population in the United States. And a million on probation. There's mass overrepresentation of minority community members in this population, much like with the male system. It does have the problem issue of what to do with the children of these individuals, both once while the mothers are incarcerated. The other issue is dealing with pregnant inmates. How long to let them keep the baby? Do they release them on ankle monitoring or something like that to avoid having to pay the cost of the medical treatment? There's a lot of logistical issues and really moral issues that come up with regards to keeping pregnant women incarcerated. Also, while the women's prisons are not safe by any objective measure, they are much less violent than male facilities. They don't have the gang system the same way that they have them in the men's facilities. Typically, in female correctional facilities, they form smaller, almost familial units where you have mother role, daughter roles, various familial roles that play in that, as opposed to the rigid violence of the male system. In addition to having specialized needs for medical care, for juvenile offenders, for female offenders, we also have to deal with offenders that are suffering mental illness. About 13% of inmates are receiving treatment for mental illness. About 10% are on some sort of psychotropic medication. It's important to give them as much care as possible to avoid them being dangerous to themselves, dangerous to the other inmates, dangerous to the officers. So an individual that's acting very unpredictably, illogically, can be very dangerous in a correctional setting. If they act in a way that's not consistent with the social norms of the facility, they might make themselves a danger. If they lash out, they might be a danger to the officers or other inmates. So it's very important to get these individuals the care and treatment they need. Unfortunately, most of them don't receive that. Much like with drug addiction, there's too many sick individuals and not enough resources to treat them. Um, Gangs are another issue in correctional facility. They often don't call them gangs; they call them security threat groups. Most of the gangs in correctional facilities are based on race, and they're there to make money. Basically, they're there to make money for the individuals that are incarcerated. They're there to make money for the larger gangs that are on the outside. They deal with things like contraband, which could be drugs, it could be food, it could be pornography, it could be cell phones. There's all manner of weapons, all manner of things that are stuck into a prison. Also, it could be based on services, handling gambling services, sex for money, violence, murder for money. All of these things are commodities inside of a prison that the gangs use as their money makers. Common ways that they've worked to address this have been to segregate the gang members, put the individuals that identify themselves as gang members in isolation, also to transfer the leaders to other facilities, isolate them. But there's only so much that can be done. They have to give Some people have to have access to lawyers and things like that, and there's a lot of ways that people have found to communicate and to pass messages inside these facilities, even when someone is in segregation. We talked about in previous lectures about the death penalty. Um, it is a sentencing option in 30 states in the federal system. The individuals that carry out these sentences are very highly trained. They're very practiced in what they do. The individual is monitored for the last 24 hours, given a health inspection, last meal. Um, Oftentimes, I was told by the officers at the Jackson facility that they offer the individuals a sedative. They usually don't take it, but they offer that to them. And then, in accordance with the order, the death warrant, the sentence is carried out. Most states use lethal injection now. There are a few states that have options that are on the books. Um, there's about a little over 3,000 people that are on death row at any given time in the United States. 55% of them are white, 42% of them are black, and again, you see a vast overrepresentation of African Americans in this population. Here on this slide is a list of various court cases dealing with the evolution of the rights of the offenders. So much like with Supreme Court cases, please go through and um, look these up individually on either on OYE or on Wikipedia. Just get a general sense of what these cases are dealing with. Okay. So here we have a list of some of the deprivations that people have when they are in a correctional facility, some of the rights that you lose, the decisions that you lose. Just review those. The last slide here is prisonization. And this is an important sort of concept that happens to people when they are in these facilities, um, where people um, adapt themselves to the routine of prison. They they basically can't function outside of the facilities, which is in direct contradiction to trying to rehabilitate these individuals and reintegrate them into the community. Um, we have a situation where people are bending their will and bending their patterns of behavior to the prison environment, and that pattern of behavior is not lined up for success when you get out. So there's a disjunct in between what people are modeling themselves after, they're changing their behavior, but they're not changing it in a pro-social, positive way that's going to help them once they get out. Um, so it's one of the major issues with the correctional system that we have, and one of the main arguments that people have for sending a lot of low-level offenders to prison is that you are basically bending their will to a prison scenario. They become that master status. They become criminals. They become prisoners, above all else, and that does not help them try to better their lives once they get out of the facility. Okay, so be sure to read the book, read the text chapters, to review these PowerPoints, watch any videos that are linked on the to-do list. Um, Contextualize this information with the other issues that we've talked about in correctional settings, and we'll be back next week with more lectures.